The moment Clement Lockhart's hand closed around Elsie Merriweather's elbow on the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1878, she did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply looked up at him with those dark amber eyes that had been haunting his dreams for 3 sleepless weeks, and she said, very quietly, "You are making a mistake, Sheriff." He had heard those words before. Every man he had ever arrested said some version of them. But none of them had ever said it the way Elsie said it, not like a plea, not like a threat, but like a simple, devastating fact she was offering him as a gift, because she believed he was still capable of receiving the truth. He did not receive it. He tightened his grip, careful not to hurt her, hating himself for the care he was taking, and he said, "The town council has made their decision, Miss Merriweather. I'm just the man who carries it out." She laughed. It was not a bitter laugh. It was warm and a little sad, and it undid something in his chest that he had spent 31 years keeping carefully fastened shut. "The man who carries it out," she repeated. "Is that all you are, Clement Lockhart?" He had not given her permission to use his first name. He had not given anyone in Caldwell permission to use his first name, and most of them were too afraid of the star on his chest to try. But Elsie Merriweather had been calling him Clement from the very first day she arrived in town 3 weeks ago, and he had never once corrected her, and he could not explain why, and it terrified him. He guided her toward the horse he had saddled for her, her own bay mare, which old Pete at the livery had kept well fed and brushed during her stay. Her single trunk was roped to the back of his own horse. He had insisted on riding with her to the county line himself. The council had wanted to just put her on the morning stage, but Clement had said he would handle it, because somewhere in the dark and dishonest corners of his heart he had wanted these last few hours with her, and that fact disgusted and destroyed him in equal measure. She mounted the mare without assistance. She was excellent with horses. She was excellent with most things, which was precisely the problem. Elsie Merriweather was too competent, too outspoken, too willing to look powerful men directly in the eye and tell them what she thought. And in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1878, that was the most dangerous kind of woman alive. As they rode out through the north end of town, past the general store and the milliner and the new telegraph office that the council was so proud of, the people of Caldwell watched from their windows and their doorways. Some of them looked ashamed. None of them spoke up. Elsie kept her chin high and her eyes forward, and Clement rode beside her in silence, and the distance between them, no more than 3 feet of hard Kansas sunlight, felt like the longest distance he had ever traveled in his life. He had to know how she had arrived here before he could understand what she was going home to. He had to go back to the beginning, because the beginning was where everything had gone wrong, and also where everything had first made terrible, beautiful sense. 3 weeks and 2 days earlier, on a Wednesday morning in late July, the westbound stage had rolled into Caldwell carrying 4 passengers and a significant amount of dust. Clement had been standing on the boardwalk outside his office, drinking coffee and watching the street with the particular brand of weary vigilance that had kept him alive for 6 years as a lawman on the Kansas frontier, when Elsie Merriweather stepped down from the stage and looked around at Caldwell, Kansas, with an expression of frank and open assessment that was so different from the usual expressions of new arrivals' fear, exhaustion, desperate hope, that he actually set his coffee down. She was 26 years old, though he did not know that yet. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up under a practical straw hat, and she was dressed neatly, but not elaborately, in a blue cotton dress that had clearly been made for traveling rather than impressing. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder that looked heavy with books or papers, and when the stage driver handed down her trunk, she made no gesture of helpless waiting, but instead grasped the handle herself and assessed the weight of it with a pragmatic little nod. Clement had seen 100 women arrive in frontier towns. They usually came one of 2 ways, either as wives sent for by lonely homesteaders, clutching letters of promise and barely held together hope, or as women with no other options, arriving to work in establishments that the town council referred to in official minutes as houses of entertainment. The women in the second category typically arrived after dark, by arrangement, and they did not look around at the town with frank assessment. They looked at it with careful blankness, which was the face a person put on when they had learned not to want things. Elsie Merriweather looked like neither category. She looked like a woman who had come to Caldwell with a specific purpose and full confidence in her right to pursue it, which in Clement's experience was a combination that usually belonged exclusively to men. He did not go and introduce himself. That was not his usual practice with new arrivals. He waited for trouble to come to him, which it generally did quickly enough. But he watched her walk down the main street with her satchel over her shoulder, pausing to read the signs above each establishment with that same frank, appraising look, until she turned into the office of the Caldwell Courier, which was the town's twice-weekly newspaper, and disappeared inside. He found out what she was doing there before noon. Word traveled fast in a town of 800 souls. Elsie Merriweather had come to Caldwell to fill the position of schoolteacher. The previous schoolteacher, a mild-mannered man named Howard Crisp, had departed for Colorado 6 weeks earlier after marrying a rancher's widow who apparently offered him a more comfortable life than the schoolroom. The town had been advertising the position for a month, and Elsie had responded to the advertisement, corresponded with the school board chairman, a hardware merchant named Silas Drummond, and received what she understood to be a formal offer of the position. What she had not understood, what Silas Drummond had carefully not mentioned in his correspondence, was that the school board's offer was dependent on the approval of the full town council, and the full town council had not yet voted, and when they voted it would be, as Clement later learned from multiple sources, extremely contentious. The contention was not about Elsie's qualifications. By every measure that could be verified in writing, she was more qualified than any teacher Caldwell had previously employed. She had completed 2 years of normal school in Ohio. She had 3 years of teaching experience in a township school outside Columbus. She had references from men of standing, a minister, a county commissioner, a school superintendent, who described her in terms so complimentary they bordered on embarrassing. The contention was about what Elsie Merriweather believed and what she was known to have done. In 1876, 2 years before her arrival in Caldwell, Elsie had been teaching in a township school in Ohio when a family named the Beaumonts had enrolled their 3 children. The Beaumont family was black. This was not, on its own, sufficient cause for controversy in that particular Ohio township, which had a relatively progressive character. The controversy arose when the parents of 4 white children withdrew their children from the school in protest of the Beaumont enrollment, and Elsie had responded to this withdrawal, not with the conciliatory diplomacy that her school board expected, but by writing a lengthy, extraordinarily well-argued letter to the county newspaper stating plainly that the withdrawal was an act of moral cowardice and educational deprivation, both of the Beaumont children and of the withdrawing children themselves, who were being taught by their own parents that cruelty was acceptable. The letter had been reprinted in several other newspapers, including one in Kansas, which was how it had reached Silas Drummond's awareness. He had not mentioned it in his correspondence with Elsie because he had hoped it would not come up. It came up on the first evening of her arrival, when Drummond's wife mentioned to another council member's wife that the new teacher had arrived and was very impressive, and the other council member's wife mentioned the letter to her husband. And by the time the sun went down the first day Elsie Merriweather spent in Caldwell, 2 of the 7 council members were already prepared to vote against her appointment. Clement learned all of this from his deputy, a young man named Walt Akers who had an extraordinary gift for collecting information from multiple sources simultaneously, and a disarming manner that caused people to tell him things they later regretted. Walt was 22 years old and deeply loyal to Clement and mildly terrified of him, which Clement considered a reasonable and functional dynamic. "She's staying at Mrs. Farley's boarding house," Walt told him, leaning in the doorway of the sheriff's office with a cup of coffee. "She already made friends with Mrs. Farley, apparently. Mrs. Farley showed her the room and she said it was fine, and then she helped Mrs. Farley carry 2 heavy boxes up from the cellar because Mrs. Farley's back has been bad. Mrs. Farley thinks she's wonderful." "What does the council think?" Clement asked, not looking up from the territorial report he was reviewing. "Drummond thinks she'll probably be fine if she keeps her opinions to herself. Harker and Voss are already against her. Fenton and Mackley haven't decided yet. Morrison thinks she's probably the most qualified candidate they'll get. Price hasn't said anything to anyone." Clement set down his pen. "And how did you find all of that out in 4 hours?" Walt smiled. "I have a gift, Sheriff." Clement did not acknowledge the gift. He picked his pen back up. "Keep an eye on things," he said. "If it stays inside the council chamber, it's not our business." It did not stay inside the council chamber. On Thursday, her second day in Caldwell, Elsie Merriweather visited the schoolhouse for the first time. The schoolhouse was a plain wooden building on the eastern edge of town, and it had been standing empty since Howard Crisp's departure, which meant 6 weeks of accumulated dust, a family of sparrows nesting in one corner of the roof, and a stack of McGuffey readers that had been left in a pile so long that the bottom ones had developed a permanent curve. Elsie borrowed a broom from Mrs. Farley, carried it to the schoolhouse, and spent the entire morning cleaning the place. Clement knew this because he walked past the schoolhouse at 10 in the morning on his regular circuit of the town's edges, and he heard the broom working vigorously inside. And he told himself he was not curious, and then he looked through the window, and he saw Elsie Merriweather on her hands and knees scrubbing the floorboards with a brush and a bucket of soapy water. Her hat hung on a peg by the door, her hair escaping its pins in the heat, and she was singing something to herself, quietly. Just at the edge of hearing, something with a brisk and cheerful melody, and the combination of her unself-conscious industriousness and that half-heard song struck him with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the situation, and he walked on quickly before she could look up and catch him staring. He had been staring too much. He recognized the symptom, and he found it alarming. In his experience, staring was the first step toward wanting, and wanting, in a frontier town where he was the law and the law required his full and undivided attention, was the first step toward a very particular kind of disaster that he had been carefully avoiding since he arrived in Caldwell 4 years ago. He was 31 years old, and he had been careful for a long time, and he intended to keep being careful, and the fact that a schoolteacher from Ohio with ink on her fingers and a forthright manner was making that intention feel fragile was something he chose to classify as a temporary and manageable problem. It was not temporary. It was not manageable. On Saturday, her 4th day in town, Elsie came to his office. She knocked on the open door with her knuckles, and he looked up and she said, "Sheriff Lockhart, I'm Elsie Merriweather. I thought I should introduce myself properly." He stood because his mother had raised him to stand when a woman entered a room, and because something about the directness of her gaze made him want to be standing when he responded to it. "I know who you are, Miss Merriweather," he said. "What can I do for you?" She came inside, which he had not explicitly invited her to do, but which he found he did not mind. She looked around his office with that same frank assessment she gave everything: the gun rack, the wanted posters, the territorial maps on the wall, the neat stack of papers on his desk, as if she were taking inventory of a room she intended to understand completely. "I'm hearing some things about the council vote," she said, "and I wanted to speak with the man who would actually need to enforce whatever they decide if they decide against me." He had not expected that. He had expected to be asked for reassurance, or for information, or for his informal support among the council, which was something various people occasionally sought. He had not expected to be addressed as a potential executor of consequences. "I enforce the town's decisions," he said carefully. "Whatever they are." "Yes," she said. "That's what I assumed." I just wanted you to know in advance that if they vote against me, I intend to contest the decision through every available legal channel, and I intend to do so loudly and in full public view. I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you because I think you're the kind of man who appreciates knowing what he's walking into." Clement looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the single window of his office and catching the copper in her hair and the particularity of her expression, which was serious and direct, and entirely without the anxiety that usually accompanied a person walking into a sheriff's office voluntarily. "What makes you think I'm that kind of man?" he asked. "Your desk," she said simply. "Everything on it is in order. You know exactly where everything is. A man who can't tolerate disorder in his paperwork generally can't tolerate it in his information either." She paused. "Also, you were the only person in Caldwell who didn't pretend not to watch when I rode in on the stage, but you also didn't stare the way the others did. You assessed and then you looked away. That's a professional habit." He almost smiled. He caught it before it arrived. "You're very observant, Miss Merriweather." "I'm a teacher," she said. "Observing is what I do." She held out her hand, not in the deferential way women sometimes extended a hand to important men, fingers down, waiting to be taken, but level, like a man offering a handshake. "I hope we won't be adversaries, Sheriff Lockhart." He shook her hand. It was a firm handshake. Her fingers had ink on them, as he had noticed, and her grip was brief but certain. "I hope so too," he said, and he meant it more than he was comfortable with. The council met the following Monday, her 5th day in Caldwell, and after 3 hours of what Walt Akers described as extremely heated discussion, they voted 4-3 against appointing Elsie Merriweather as the town's schoolteacher. The 4 votes against were Harker, Voss, Drummond, and this was the one that made Clement's jaw tighten, Price, who had apparently decided in the final hour that the path of least conflict with his more vocal colleagues was worth more than his private opinion. Drummond came to the sheriff's office that same afternoon, after the vote. He was a large man with a florid complexion, and the manner of someone who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he entered. He sat down across Clement's desk without being invited to sit, and he said, "We'll need you to handle Miss Merriweather." "What does that mean?" Clement asked. "It means she needs to leave Caldwell. The vote has been taken. The position is closed. If she stays, she'll stir up trouble. You know how these situations develop. Best to get ahead of it." Clement said, "She hasn't committed any crime. I can't force a citizen to leave a town." Drummond's expression shifted into the particular arrangement of features that Clement had seen on powerful men's faces before, the compression around the mouth that meant a pleasantry was being abandoned, and a calculation was taking its place. "She's not technically a citizen yet. She arrived as a job candidate. The job's been filled otherwise. She has no legal reason to remain." "Who filled the position?" Clement asked. "We'll find someone," Drummond said, which meant they had not found anyone yet, which meant the schoolhouse would stand empty, and the children of Caldwell would go without education for another month or 2 while the council found someone more agreeable. Clement had thoughts about this that he kept firmly to himself. "I'll speak to her," he said, "formally, with the council's official communication in writing. I want it in writing, Silas." Drummond wrote the letter himself, which was a document of impressive bureaucratic cowardice. It did not mention the Ohio letter. It did not mention any specific objection to Elsie's character. It simply stated that the position had been filled through other means, and that the town thanked Miss Merriweather for her interest and wished her well in her future endeavors. And it was signed by all 7 council members, including the 3 who had voted for her, which told Clement something about the specific texture of moral failure that made frontier politics so deeply dispiriting. He went to Mrs. Farley's boarding house that evening. He had the letter in his breast pocket, and he felt it there like something uncomfortable, like a stone in a shoe. Mrs. Farley let him in with a look of such complete and obvious disapproval that he had to respect it, and she sent the young girl who helped her with the housekeeping upstairs to ask if Miss Merriweather would come down to the parlor. Elsie came down. She was wearing a different dress, a darker one, a kind of deep green, and her hair was down for the evening, pinned back loosely at the sides, and the sight of her in the warm lamplight of Mrs. Farley's parlor with that particular expression of calm readiness did something very unfortunate to Clement's concentration. He gave her the letter. He watched her read it. Her expression did not change substantially, a slight tightening at the corners of her eyes, a fractional shift in the set of her mouth, and then the stillness that was. He was beginning to understand how Elsie Merriweather processed difficulty, not with outward emotion but with a quality of intensified inward processing, as if she were running the information through every available perspective simultaneously before deciding what to do with it. "They found someone else," she said when she had finished the letter. "I don't believe they have yet," he said. He had not intended to tell her that. It came out anyway. She looked at him. "Then this is about my letter, the Ohio letter. I think it's a factor," he said, which was dishonest in its understatement, and he thought she knew it, but she simply nodded. "What happens now?" she asked. "The council would like you to consider your purpose in Caldwell concluded," he said. "They've asked me to formally make that communication. And if I don't consider it concluded," he was very careful with this next part, "they haven't given me grounds to compel you to leave. You haven't committed any crime. You have the same right to be in this town as any other free citizen of Kansas." He paused. "I'm just the messenger of their preference, Miss Merriweather." She folded the letter precisely along its original creases and handed it back to him. "Keep it," she said. "I don't want it." He took it. Their fingers were very close to touching as the paper transferred between them, and neither of them moved back, and for a moment the parlor of Mrs. Farley's boarding house was absolutely silent except for the distant sound of the street outside and the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. "I'll think about my next step," she said. "Thank you for coming in person, Sheriff Lockhart." "Clement," he said before he could stop himself. She looked surprised only slightly, but he caught it. "I'm sorry." "You've been calling me Clement since you arrived," he said. "You might as well keep doing it." The corners of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the same family as one. "Clement," she said. "Thank you." He left. He walked back to his office in the dark and sat at his desk for a long time staring at the territorial maps on the wall. And he thought about the way she had said his name, careful and warm and specific, as if his name were a thing of some significance. And he thought about the letter in his pocket and what it meant and what he was going to do. He did not do anything that night or the next morning because there was genuinely nothing legal to do, and because he was hoping, with a hope he recognized as unprofessional and possibly irrational, that the situation would resolve itself in Elsie's favor. It did not resolve itself in Elsie's favor. It accelerated against it. On Friday of that week, her 9th day in Caldwell, Elsie did something that Clement heard about from 3 different sources within 2 hours of its occurrence, all 3 of them describing it with varying combinations of admiration and alarm that told him a great deal about the fault lines running through Caldwell's population. There was a family named the Hawkins who lived on a small homestead 2 miles east of town. The father, Dale Hawkins, was a man of middling competence and maximum self-certainty, whose most notable quality was an absolutely impermeable confidence in his own judgment, which bore an inverse relationship to the accuracy of that judgment. Dale Hawkins had a wife named Ruth and 4 children, the oldest of whom was a girl of 12 named Clara. Clara Hawkins was, by every account Clement had gathered without particularly trying, one of the most intellectually capable children in the county, and she was not currently attending school because Dale Hawkins had decided that girls of 12 had learned enough from books and should be spending their time learning household skills in preparation for marriage. Clara Hawkins had been attending the schoolhouse irregularly before Howard Crisp's departure, coming on days when her father was away from the homestead, and her mother looked the other direction, which told Clement everything he needed to know about Ruth Hawkins's private opinion of her husband's educational philosophy. On Friday, Elsie had gone to the Hawkins homestead. She had not been invited. She had learned about Clara from Mrs. Farley, who had learned about her from the same patchwork of observant women's knowledge that provided more useful intelligence about the community than anything Clement's formal channels produced. Elsie had ridden out to the homestead, introduced herself to Ruth Hawkins, and been in the middle of a conversation about Clara's education when Dale Hawkins came in from the fields. The conversation that followed was, by all accounts, heated. Dale Hawkins told Elsie in explicit terms that his children's education was his concern and not hers, and that women who went around advising other families on child-rearing were meddlesome and unwelcome. Elsie, according to Ruth Hawkins, who recounted it privately to Mrs. Farley, said that Clara was capable of achievements that her current situation would prevent, that this was a waste the community could not afford and Clara herself deserved better than, and that Dale Hawkins was making a decision he did not have the information to properly evaluate. Dale Hawkins had apparently found this characterization of his decision-making capacity offensive, which was understandable, and he had told Elsie to get off his land, which was his legal right, and she had left. But before she left, she had pressed into Clara Hawkins's hands a copy of a book that she had brought with her specifically for this purpose, a collection of essays by women scientists and thinkers, published in 1874, which was the kind of book that did not ordinarily reach rural Kansas homesteads, and she had said, loudly enough for Dale Hawkins to hear, "You are not limited by what anyone else tells you that you are." This story reached Silas Drummond before sundown. By Saturday morning, Drummond had been to see 2 other council members, and by Saturday evening Clement had a second visit from Drummond, this time accompanied by Voss and Harker, and this time the tone was not a preference. It was a directive. "She's causing disruption," Drummond said. "She's interfering with family affairs. She's a destabilizing influence and we want her gone." Clement said, "She visited a family and had a conversation. That's not a crime." "She's staying in this town specifically to make trouble," Harker said. He was a thin, tight-faced man who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and had the political influence to match. "She's not here for any legitimate purpose now that the teaching position is closed. She's here because she thinks she can embarrass us into changing our decision." Clement looked at Harker for a moment. "Is she embarrassing you?" Harker's face went a color that Clement found informative. "That is not the point." "I need grounds," Clement said. "Legal grounds. Can any of you give me legal grounds?" There was a silence. Then Drummond said, "There's the question of vagrancy." The vagrancy statute in Caldwell was a loose and frequently abused piece of municipal ordinance that technically allowed the town to compel the removal of individuals who could not demonstrate lawful reason to be present. It had been used primarily against homeless men passing through on their way west, and occasionally Clement knew this, and it sat in his stomach like a cold stone against individuals the town council simply found inconvenient. It was legal. It was also the kind of law that grew thorns when you touched it. Clement said, very quietly, "She has lawful accommodation at Mrs. Farley's establishment, for which she is paying. She has traveled here in response to a professional invitation from the school board. The position may have been withdrawn, but the invitation creates a reasonable basis for presence." Drummond said, "Clement, we're not asking you for a legal argument. We're asking you to do your job." The use of his first name was deliberate. It was the council's signal that they were speaking to him not as the town's lawman but as their employee, which was technically what he was. The council held his contract, paid his salary, and could remove him from his position with a majority vote. He had known this since the day he took the job, and it had never before felt like the trap it evidently was. He had always assumed that his integrity and the council's wishes would remain sufficiently aligned that the trap would never need to be sprung. He was discovering, at the age of 31, that this assumption had been naively optimistic. He said, "Give me until Monday. I'll handle it Monday." They accepted this because they had enough confidence in him to believe that Monday meant compliance, and because they wanted to believe that, because the alternative, a sheriff who prioritized his own judgment over the council's directives, was a problem that would require them to do uncomfortable things. He spent Sunday thinking. He spent it in the way he processed difficult problems, which was to walk long distances and say nothing to anyone, and let the arguments arrange themselves in rows in his head until they were in the right order. He walked south of town, along the creek bed that ran dry in summer, through the tall grass that was starting to go gold at the edges with the late August heat, and he thought about the law and what it was for, and what it did when the men who made it used it as a tool against the people it was supposed to protect. He thought about Elsie Merriweather, which he had been mostly trying not to do. He thought about her handshake and the way she had given him back the letter, and the sentence she had said to him on her first day. "You are making a mistake, Sheriff," which she hadn't said yet because it was still Sunday and Monday hadn't happened yet, but which he already somehow knew she was going to say, because she was the kind of woman who named things precisely. He thought about Clara Hawkins and the book with essays by women scientists, pressed into the hands of a 12-year-old girl who had been told she was done learning. He thought about the 3 council members who had voted for Elsie, and then signed a letter that said otherwise. He thought about what it meant to enforce a law you found unjust, and whether doing it once created a precedent that made it easier to do again, and what kind of man you became after enough of those precedents accumulated. He did not arrive at any comfortable conclusions. He arrived at Monday. On Monday morning he went to Mrs. Farley's boarding house before 9. Elsie was at breakfast. Mrs. Farley gave him a look that communicated, with a precision that no words could have matched, exactly what she thought of the situation and of him, and she went to the kitchen with pointed deliberateness, leaving them alone in the dining room. Elsie looked up from her plate. She looked at him, at his face, and then at his eyes, and then she seemed to read everything in his expression because she set down her fork and she said, "It's today." "It's today," he said. She nodded slowly. "How long do I have?" "Whenever you're ready. I'll wait." She finished her breakfast. He stood in the doorway and watching her finish her breakfast steadily, unhurriedly, as if this morning were like any other morning, was one of the more affecting things he had witnessed in his adult life. She was not going to give them the satisfaction of visible distress. She was going to eat her eggs and her biscuit and her cup of coffee, and she was going to pack her trunk, and she was going to ride out of this town with her spine straight and her chin up, and she was going to do all of it without giving Silas Drummond and his colleagues a single moment of the capitulation they wanted to see. It took her 45 minutes to pack. She came downstairs and embraced Mrs. Farley, who was weeping openly, which Mrs. Farley would have described as entirely out of character, and which Clement suspected was a more regular occurrence than the landlady would admit. Elsie held the older woman for a long moment, saying something quietly that he could not hear, and then she pulled back and pressed Mrs. Farley's hands and smiled at her with a warmth so genuine that it hit Clement in the chest like something physical. And then they were outside and he was guiding her toward the horse and she was saying, "You are making a mistake, Sheriff," and he was saying, "The town council has made their decision," and hating himself for every word, and she was saying, "Is that all you are, Clement Lockhart?" And he did not answer her because he did not trust the answer. They rode north in the morning heat, side by side on the empty road, with her trunk roped to his saddle and her mare's hooves raising small clouds of dust with every step. The town fell away behind them. The Kansas prairie opened out around them, enormous and indifferent, all that golden grass under all that blue sky, and for a stretch of several miles they said nothing at all, and the silence between them was the most complicated thing Clement had experienced in a long time. He broke it about 4 miles out from town. He had not planned to. He said, "I voted for you." She looked at him. He was not on the council. She knew he was not on the council. But she understood what he meant, that if he had been, he would have voted for her, and that this was as close as a man in his position could come to saying that he was sorry, and that it was not enough. "I know," she said, which was impossible, but she said it with such quiet certainty that he believed she did know somehow, and that made the ride worse and better simultaneously in a combination he couldn't parse. At the county line there was a marker stone, old and weather-pitted, and he stopped his horse there and she stopped hers, and he said formally, "This is the boundary of Caldwell Township jurisdiction." He did not say beyond this line the council has no authority, but that was there in the sentence and she heard it. She looked at him for a long moment. "Where is the road to Dodge City from here?" he pointed. She nodded. She looked like she was thinking rapidly, the way she always seemed to think, through multiple options at once. "And if I were to travel north of the boundary and then circle back by a different route?" He kept his expression very still. "I can't restrict your movements outside the town limits," he said. "I have no jurisdiction over what happens outside Caldwell Township." She held his gaze. He held hers. Something that was not quite a conversation happened between them in that exchange of looks, and he was not sure either of them could have named it, but they both felt it, because the air changed in the way it does when something significant has been silently agreed upon. "Safe travels, Sheriff Lockhart," she said. "Miss Merriweather," he said. She turned her horse north. He watched her go until she was a small figure against the immensity of the prairie, and then he turned his horse back toward Caldwell, and he rode the 4 miles back to town with the empty saddle beside him where her trunk had been, and the dust settling back down on the road, and the feeling of having done something that he could not undo. He did not expect to sleep that night. He did not. He sat at his desk until 2 in the morning reviewing territorial reports that he read without registering, and then he went home to his small house at the end of Chestnut Street and lay on his bed, and stared at the ceiling and thought about Elsie Merriweather somewhere north of the county line, making her calculations, planning her next move, because she was absolutely making a next move. He knew that with the same certainty you know about weather when you've spent enough years reading the sky. Tuesday was ordinary. Wednesday was ordinary. On Wednesday afternoon, a young rancher came in to report a missing horse, and Clement took the report and sent Walt out to follow up and spent the rest of the afternoon doing paperwork and not thinking about where Elsie was or what she was doing, with complete lack of success. On Thursday evening, Walt came in from his rounds with an expression that was specifically the expression of a person who has information they are not sure how to deliver, and Clement set down his pen and said, "What?" Walt said, "There's a woman camped about a mile south of the Bender Creek crossing. Old Pete from the livery rode out there to check on some grazing land he leases, and he saw her camp." Clement's pen was still in his hand. He set it down very deliberately. "What kind of woman?" Walt's expression became even more carefully neutral. "Auburn hair, blue dress, bay mare." Clement sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Is she on Caldwell Township land?" Walt said slowly. "The Bender Creek crossing is 3 miles south. She's a mile south of that. So she's 4 miles south of town." He paused. "The township boundary is 3 miles south. She's a mile outside the boundary." Clement said, "Then she's not in violation of anything." Walt said, "No, sir, she's not." There was a silence. Then Walt said, "She's been there since Tuesday, Pete thinks. He says her camp is well organized. She has supplies for at least another week." And he stopped. "And," Clement said, "she's been teaching," Walt said. "Clara Hawkins has been riding out to her camp every morning, and 2 other children from homesteads in that area. She set up a classroom under a cottonwood tree beside the creek. She has books. She has a chalkboard, a small one, portable, the kind a traveling teacher might carry." Clement was quiet for a long time. In his mind he could see it very clearly and specifically. Elsie Merriweather in the shade of a cottonwood tree by a creek, in the open air 4 miles outside the town that had told her to leave, teaching Clara Hawkins and 2 other children things that Clara Hawkins would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was so perfectly, specifically Elsie, that he almost made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "Has anyone complained?" he asked. "Not to me," Walt said. "To the council?" "Not yet," Walt said. But Pete told his wife, and his wife told her sister, and her sister's husband is Fenton, who's on the council, so he left the rest of the sentence in the air. Clement looked at the territorial map on his wall. He looked at the county line, and the Bender Creek crossing, and the stretch of prairie south of there, where a woman had camped for 3 days in the late August heat, and built herself a schoolroom out of a tree and grass and refusal. He thought about the day he had ridden beside her to the county line, and the thing that had not quite been said, and about whether what she was doing now was what he had meant when he had not said it. He thought it probably was. He thought she had understood him precisely, and had done what she always did with precise understanding. She had used it. On Friday morning, Clement Lockhart saddled his horse before 6. He told Walt he was riding out to check on a matter south of town and would be back by midday. Walt did not ask any questions because Walt had an extraordinary gift, and that gift included knowing when not to ask questions. He rode south. The morning was clear and still, the heat not yet arrived, the grass silver with dew. He crossed the Bender Creek Bridge, the wooden planks hollow sounding under his horse's feet, and continued south. And after about a mile, he saw the small tent among the cottonwoods by the creek and the ring of stones from a fire, and the bay mare grazing on a long tether in the grass, and Elsie Merriweather sitting on a fallen log outside her tent reading a book with a cup of coffee in her hand, entirely unperturbed by his arrival, as if she had expected him at approximately this time. He dismounted. He tied his horse to a tree. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him over the edge of her book with the particular amber steadiness of her gaze, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You came back," he said. "I never left," she said. "I just moved." He almost laughed. He actually almost laughed. It startled him because he was not a man who laughed easily, and the fact that she could produce the almost laugh with such economy of effort was informative in a way he was trying not to be informed. "The council will hear about this," he said. "The council's jurisdiction ends 3 miles north of here," she said. "You told me that yourself." He had not told her that. He had let her hear the space around what he had not said, but she was right that the implication had been deliberate, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He sat down on the log beside her. There was enough space between them for propriety, but the log was not long, and the cottonwood shade was cool, and the creek made a quiet sound in the grass behind them, and the morning sat around them with a particular quality of stillness that Clement did not want to disturb. "What's your plan?" he asked. She closed her book. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said, "Drummond and his colleagues are afraid of what I represent. Not me specifically, they don't know me well enough for that. They're afraid of the idea that someone might look at how they make decisions and write about it clearly in a public letter. They think visibility is dangerous." She paused. "They're right that it is. It's dangerous to them. And you're planning to be visible," he said. "I'm already visible," she said. "I'm 4 miles south of the town boundary teaching 3 children who weren't being taught. By Monday there will be 5 children because 2 more families have expressed interest. By the end of the month I'll have 8. When the weather turns cold, I'll need a building." She looked at him. "I'm going to need allies inside the town limits." He looked at her profile. The morning light was honest and direct, and it showed everything: the tiredness around her eyes from 3 nights in a tent, the set of her jaw that meant she had thought through every obstacle and found none of them sufficient to stop her. "You want me to come back to Caldwell with you," he said. "I want you to escort me back to Caldwell," she said. "Officially, today. So that when Drummond asks you why you allowed it, you can say truthfully that you assessed the situation and found no legal grounds for refusal, which is true." He sat with this. It was true. He had checked. He had spent Tuesday evening reading every relevant statute in the territorial code, looking for something that would allow the council to act against her, and finding nothing, because Elsie Merriweather had been careful in exactly the right ways. She had not committed a crime. She had not violated any ordinance. She had been a private citizen exercising her right to travel, camp on public land, and share knowledge with willing recipients who sought her out voluntarily. And when Drummond and Harker pushed back, he said, They'll push back regardless, she said. The question is whether they push back against a woman alone or against a woman with the law standing beside her. He thought about this sentence. He thought about what it meant that she was asking for this, not his heart, not his name, not his house, but his authority placed in her service, which was its own kind of vulnerability on her part because asking for protection meant acknowledging that you needed it, and he sensed that acknowledgement cost her something. If I do this, he said, I'm placing myself in opposition to the council. They employ me. They can remove me. I know, she said quietly. I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to do it because it's the right thing. He looked at her then fully, and she met his look without deflection, and the thing between them that had been building since she walked into his office with her hand out like a handshake and her voice like something true. It was right there between them in the morning air, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved toward it yet, because the situation was still fragile and the ground was still uncertain, and they were both people who moved carefully on uncertain ground. But he stood up. He offered her his hand level, like a handshake, returning the gesture she had given him in his office a week ago. She looked at it and then at his face, and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and they stood very close for a moment in the cottonwood shade by the morning creek, and he said, "Let me help you break down the camp." It took them an hour to break down Elsie's camp and pack her mare and load her portable chalkboard, which was indeed remarkably compact, and her trunk of books, which she had been keeping at the camp and which was heavy enough that he carried it himself without being asked. She made a second cup of coffee over the remains of her fire and gave him one without asking if he wanted it, which he did, and they drank them standing in the early morning light before dousing the fire and stamping the ashes and leaving the cottonwood grove as close to undisturbed as possible. They rode north. They crossed the Bender Creek Bridge together. They came up through the southern edge of Caldwell's outlying farms and then into the town proper, and Clement did not ride slightly behind her, as if escorting an inconvenient problem to its conclusion. He rode beside her, at the same level, at an unhurried pace that announced without any words that he was here by choice and knew it. People saw them arrive. Of course they did. It was not yet 8 in the morning, and already the general store was open, and the blacksmith was working, and several women were out on their boardwalk errands, and each of them looked up as the sheriff and the woman he had escorted out of town on Monday came riding back together on Friday morning, as if Monday had simply been an interruption in an ongoing itinerary. Walt Akers was outside the sheriff's office. He looked at them with the studiously neutral expression of a man who had expected something and was gratified to see it arrive. He took the horses without being asked. Clement walked Elsie to Mrs. Farley's boarding house. Mrs. Farley opened the door before they knocked and stood in the doorway with a wide, wet-eyed expression that communicated without any ambiguity that she had been hoping for exactly this. She pulled Elsie inside with the practical affection of a woman who had decided in a week to care about someone and was not going to be discouraged from it by bureaucratic interference. Clement said, "I'll speak to the council this morning." Mrs. Farley said from inside, "You'll have breakfast first." He had breakfast at Mrs. Farley's table, eggs and salt pork and fresh biscuits and coffee, and he sat across from Elsie Merriweather, who had clearly slept better in a tent for 3 nights than he had in his own bed, and who ate her breakfast with the same steady unhurriedness she had displayed on Monday, and who looked up from her food partway through and caught him watching her and did not look away. Neither did he. It lasted only a moment, 3 or 4 seconds of held gaze across Mrs. Farley's breakfast table, and then Mrs. Farley came in from the kitchen, and the moment reorganized itself into something more ordinary, but something had been said in it that they both heard. He went to the council meeting. He requested it through Drummond's clerk, who conveyed his request with evident surprise, and by 9:30 the council was assembled in the town hall, all 7 of them, with varying expressions of wariness, expectation, and in Fenton's case, a kind of hopeful curiosity that suggested he had been waiting for something to shift. Clement stood at the head of the room. He was not a man who needed theatrical staging. His stillness carried its own authority, and in 6 years the council had learned to read his stillness the way sailors read a sky. He said, "Miss Merriweather is back in town. She's staying at Mrs. Farley's. I brought her back myself." There was silence, and then several people spoke at once, and he waited until they finished, and then he said, "She has not committed any crime. She has not violated any ordinance. She camped on public land outside the town's jurisdiction for 4 days, which she has every right to do. I reviewed the territorial statute thoroughly and found no legal basis to compel her continued absence, and I will not act without legal basis. That's the end of it." Drummond said, "Clement, we had an agreement. We had your expectation," Clement said. "Not an agreement. I told you I would handle it. I handled it. She left. She came back. People come and go in Caldwell every day, and we do not generally meet them at the city limits to turn them around, Silas." Harker said, "She's a troublemaker. She interfered with the Hawkins family. She visited a homestead and had a conversation," Clement said. "Dale Hawkins asked her to leave and she left. That's what happened. I checked." Voss said, "The town voted on this. The town voted on a job position," Clement said. "A person isn't a job position. She has as much right to be in Caldwell as you do." There was another silence, longer this time and with a different texture. Morrison and Mackley, 2 of the 3 who had voted for Elsie, were watching Clement with expressions of carefully suppressed satisfaction. Fenton was doing something similar. Drummond's face had gone the color that meant he was furious and calculating simultaneously, which was his most dangerous expression. Harker and Voss were exchanging a look. Then Drummond said slowly, "You understand that you're making an enemy, Clement." Clement said, "I understand my obligations to this town and to the law I've been hired to represent. Those obligations don't include removing citizens for the crime of holding opinions you disagree with." He paused. "If the council feels I'm not fulfilling my role adequately, you have the means to address that through proper channels, but I won't be changing my position." He left the meeting. He walked back to his office and sat down at his desk and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed steadily for a moment because his heart was beating harder than the situation perhaps warranted, and he needed it to stop. Walt appeared in the doorway. "How did it go?" "About how you'd expect," Clement said. "Are you fired?" "Not yet," Clement said. He picked up his pen. The next few days were a particular kind of tense. Drummond was cold to him when they passed on the street. Harker stopped speaking to him entirely, which was almost a relief. But Morrison stopped him outside the hardware store on Saturday to shake his hand and say, gruffly, "Good man," and then walk on without further comment, which was more than enough. Elsie stayed at Mrs. Farley's and resumed her activities with a kind of methodical calm that Clement found both admirable and alarming in its implications. She visited families. She corresponded through the post office, which was outside the council's ability to intercept legally. And she began appearing at the town's small civic gatherings with the same frank presence she brought to everything. She also began talking to people about the schoolhouse. Not to the council, to the families who had children, to the ranchers and homesteaders and merchants who paid taxes to support it, to the people who had, in various ways, the authority that precedes official authority in any community. She was not inflammatory about it. She was precise. She laid out facts and asked questions and listened to the answers with complete attention, and she had a quality that Clement recognized as one of the rarest in human discourse. She was genuinely interested in what people thought, not as a tactical maneuver, but as an actual feature of her character, and people felt it and responded to it. By the following Thursday, 6 families had formally petitioned the council to reconsider the teaching appointment. By Friday, 2 more had joined. Morrison and Fenton and Mackley were pressing for a new vote. Drummond was resisting, but the arithmetic was changing beneath him, and he could feel it. Clement watched all of this from his customary position of professional distance, which was increasingly difficult to maintain. He watched Elsie because he could not entirely stop watching her, and what he watched was a person methodically and patiently, and without visible anger rebuilding the ground she had been removed from, which was one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen anyone do. He spoke to her when their paths naturally crossed, which was often, because Caldwell was not a large town and they were both people who spent their days in its public spaces. He spoke to her the way he spoke to everyone, with the measured courtesy of his professional manner, and she met this manner with her characteristic directness and warmth, and these conversations were consistently the best part of his day, which he was aware of and found inconvenient. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of September, there was a social gathering at the town hall, a harvest supper organized by several of the women's groups that were the backbone of Caldwell's civic life. These events happened several times a year and attendance was general, because the frontier created in people a powerful need for communal warmth and any excuse for gathering. Clement went because he always went, because showing up at these events was part of his understanding of his role, which was not limited to enforcing statutes, but extended to being present in the community he was there to serve. He wore his good shirt, which he had pressed himself that morning, and he left his gun at the office because carrying a firearm to a harvest supper was the kind of aggressive symbolism he actively disliked. Elsie was there. She was talking to Ruth Hawkins, who had apparently decided that whatever her husband thought about Elsie's visit to their homestead, she herself had no objection to the woman's company. Clara Hawkins was there too, standing close to Elsie with the particular attention of a young person in the presence of someone they admire, and Elsie was showing her something in a small book she had produced from her bag, pointing to something on the page, explaining it, while Clara's eyes went wider and wider with whatever information was landing. Clement watched this for a moment and then looked away and accepted a cup of cider from Mrs. Morrison and talked to the Morrison boys about cattle prices, which was a reliable conversation that required very little of him while he was thinking about something else. He did not precisely plan what happened next. He was standing near the edge of the room when the evening's musical entertainment began, a fiddler named Josephus who played for these events with enthusiastic imprecision, and Elsie appeared beside him in a moment when a dance had just started and people were moving to the center of the room. "You're not dancing," she said. "I generally don't," he said. "Is that because you can't or because you choose not to?" She asked, which was exactly the kind of question that cut through the usual social lubricant and got directly to the thing underneath. He looked at her. She was wearing a dark red dress that he had not seen before, something she had clearly saved for occasions that warranted it, and her hair was pinned up with what looked like careful effort, and she was looking at him with that amber directness, and the fiddle was playing something warm and undemanding, and the room was full of people who were not paying attention to them specifically, and he said, "I choose not to. Generally." "What about non-generally?" she said. He held out his hand, not a handshake this time. "An invitation." She looked at it, a glance, brief and confirming, and she took it, and they went on to the floor with the other couples, and he put his hand on her waist and she put hers on his shoulder, and they began to move. He was a competent dancer, despite what he had implied. His mother had insisted on it as a childhood education, and he had maintained the skill with the same quiet thoroughness he maintained every skill that seemed worth keeping. Elsie was more than competent. She was good, light and precise, following his lead with a quality of attention that was itself remarkable, because she was not a person who defaulted to following, and her choice to do so here felt significant. They did not talk while they danced. The fiddle played and the room turned around them and they moved in the small considered space between them, and every place where his hand pressed hers, and where her fingers rested on his shoulder was absolutely present in his awareness, with an intensity that he ordinarily reserved for situations requiring his full professional attention, which told him that his body had made up its mind about this woman, several weeks before his conscious judgment was prepared to acknowledge the same conclusion. The song ended, they stopped. She looked up at him. She was not short, but he was taller by a meaningful margin, and the room came back around them with all its noise and warmth and ordinary complexity. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you, Clement." "For the dance," he said. "For Friday," she said. "For coming to get me." He said, "You'd already decided to come back. I just gave you company on the road." She smiled at that, a full smile, which he had seen before but which still had a specific effect on his equilibrium that he was entirely failing to control. "That's all most people need," she said. "Company on the road." He drove her back to Mrs. Farley's that evening in the town's small buggy that the sheriff's office maintained for occasions that required something more formal than a horse. It was a short drive. Everything in Caldwell was a short drive. And the September night was clear and mild, with a sky full of stars spread across the dark, in that particular extravagance that the plain sky only shows when there are no mountains to interrupt it. He helped her down from the buggy, which she did not need help with but accepted without comment, and they stood on the boardwalk in front of Mrs. Farley's for a moment in the starlight. She said, "I'm going to win this, you know." "I know," he said. "The council will come around. Or enough of them will, which amounts to the same thing." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him with that quiet steadiness. "And then what?" He looked at her. The question was bigger than the teaching appointment, and they both knew it. "Then you'll be the schoolteacher," he said, "and I'll still be the sheriff." And, she said, he was not a man who spoke about interior states. He had learned early in life that speaking about what you wanted was a form of risk that cost proportionally to how much you meant it. And he had managed the economy of that risk by mostly not wanting things very much, which had served him adequately until about 3 weeks ago, when a woman with ink on her fingers and a handshake like a contract had arrived on the westbound stage and recalibrated everything without apparently trying to. He said, "And I would like to continue your acquaintance, Miss Merriweather, if you're willing." She said, "Elsie." "Elsie," he said. "And I would like that very much," she said, and she went inside, and he drove the buggy back to the stable with the September stars above him and the smell of her perfume, something light and practical, not elaborate, still faint in the air of the buggy. And he sat in the stable for a moment after unhitching the horse and allowed himself to feel something that he hadn't felt in a very long time, which was hopeful. The council vote happened the following week. It was 5-2 in favor of appointing Elsie Merriweather as Caldwell's schoolteacher, Drummond and Harker being the 2 votes against, which was no longer sufficient, and Fenton brought her the news himself, with Morrison and Mackley and Price standing behind him, in a small delegation of men who had decided that being on the right side of a thing late was better than never getting there at all. Drummond came to Clement's office 2 days later. He sat across the desk in the chair he always commandeered without invitation, and he said, "You've made your point, Clement." Clement said, "I haven't been making a point. I've been doing my job." Drummond looked at him with the appraising expression of a man who is deciding whether to accept a reframing. Then he said, "The town is happy with her. The families are pleased. Even Dale Hawkins has stopped making noise about it, which I frankly didn't expect." He paused. "The woman has a gift." "Yes," Clement said, "she does." "I still think the Ohio business was a poor judgment call," Drummond said. Clement said, "I disagree." He met Drummond's eyes and held them, steady and clear, and Drummond was the first to look away, which was perhaps petty, but Clement accepted it. The schoolhouse opened on the first Monday in October, 1878. Elsie had spent the 2 weeks before opening cleaning it again, more thoroughly than the first time, with Mrs. Farley's help and the help of several of the women from the families, whose children would be attending and decorating it in ways that were both practical and considered. A map of the United States on the east wall, a chart of multiplication tables, a shelf of books organized by level and subject, and in one corner a small collection of pressed wildflowers that Clara Hawkins had brought in on the last day of preparation and arranged in a jar, which Elsie had placed on her desk where she could see it every time she looked up from her work. There were 11 children on the first day. By the end of October, there were 14. Elsie taught them reading and arithmetic and history and geography, and carefully, because the world was what it was and Caldwell was where it was, she also taught them to think, which was the most important thing, and the thing that was hardest to defend to parents who were not sure they wanted it. Clement took to walking past the schoolhouse in the morning on his circuit of the town, and sometimes in the afternoon he could hear her through the open window, her voice clear and direct in the way of all the things she said, asking questions rather than delivering pronouncements, which was apparently how she taught, how she turned everything over and looked at the other side and expected the children to do the same. He found reasons to stop and talk to her that he would not have manufactured for anyone else. She found reasons to bring things to his attention that she could have addressed through other channels. It was a careful courtship conducted in the language of professional courtesy, in plain sight of a town that watched them with varying degrees of fondness and speculation, and it was one of the most pleasurable and frustrating experiences of Clement Lockhart's life. In late October, he asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon. He had thought about asking for approximately 2 weeks and had not done it, and finally did it on a Sunday morning outside the church after the service, standing on the church steps with half of Caldwell visible behind her, which was probably not the ideal setting, but he had concluded that waiting for an ideal setting was simply a more socially acceptable form of cowardice. She said yes with an immediacy that was gratifying. They walked south through the town, and then out onto the prairie on a track that led toward a small rise where you could see the full width of the horizon in every direction. The day was cool and bright, one of those October plains days that are so clear and cold-edged that everything looks more real than usual, more itself. They talked for a long time, not about the council or the school or the politics of the town, which they had talked about sufficiently. They talked about themselves, where they had come from, what they had wanted, what they had thought the world was going to be, and how it had turned out differently from that in ways that were sometimes losses and sometimes not. Elsie had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the daughter of a printer and a woman who had taught herself to read Latin, which was an unusual thing to know about someone, and which explained a great deal about Elsie's character. She had known she wanted to teach from the time she was 8 years old, and had spent an afternoon explaining how to read to a neighbor's child who was having trouble, and had found the moment of comprehension, when the thing clicked into place in the other person's understanding, to be the most satisfying experience of her life. She had pursued this vocation with the same purposefulness she brought to everything, and the Ohio letter and its consequences and the journey to Kansas had all been part of the same ongoing decision, which was to be fully herself even when that was inconvenient for everyone involved. She said, "I used to worry that I was too much, too direct, too sure of my own opinions. My mother told me that was ridiculous, that I was exactly the right amount of everything, but mothers are supposed to say that." "Your mother was right," Clement said. She looked at him sidelong with a small smile. "You sound very certain about that." "I am," he said. "I've met a great many people who are not enough of themselves. Too little conviction, too much accommodation of other people's preferences. It makes them unreliable in important moments." He paused. "You are not that." She was quiet for a moment after he said this. Then she said, "What about you?" He looked at the horizon. The sky over the western edge of the plains was going orange and deep blue in the late afternoon, one of those prairie sunsets that looked painted and were real. "I'm a different kind of problem," he said. "I'm a person who decided a long time ago to want very little, because wanting things creates vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities in my line of work can get people killed." She said, "Do you still believe that?" He thought about the 3 nights he hadn't slept when she was camped south of Bender Creek, about the Saturday morning he had ridden to get her with his heart doing something architecturally unsound in his chest, about every conversation they had had and every conversation he had imagined having, and the way her name sat in his mind like something with weight. He said, "Less than I used to." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were on the rise, with Caldwell small and bright below them to the north and the immensity of the prairie in every other direction, and the sky turning all those colors above them. And she turned to face him and he turned to face her, and she said, "I was hoping you'd say something like that." He kissed her. He did it properly, with deliberateness, not impetuosity, because that was who he was, and she kissed him back with the same quality of decision that she brought to everything. And the sunset went on doing what it was doing around them, lavish and indifferent and perfect. And when they broke apart, she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was open and unguarded and warm. And he thought he had probably been working his way toward this moment since the day she walked into his office with her hand out and her eyes direct, and her ink-stained fingers, and her absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. "I should have let you stay on Monday," he said. She put her hand against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart there. "You needed to figure some things out," she said, "and so did the town." "And did it," he said, "figure things out?" "Getting there," she said, "slowly, like everything does." They walked back to town in the darkening evening, not talking much, with the comfortable silence between them that is different from the uncomfortable kind and better than most words. He left her at Mrs. Farley's with a propriety that was somewhat at odds with the afternoon's development on the prairie. But they were in a small town where everyone watched, and they were both people who respected the distinction between private and public. And Mrs. Farley had been watching from the front window with a cup of tea, and an expression of acute, interested satisfaction that Clement could see from the street, and which caused him to keep his farewell brief and Mrs. Farley appropriate. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a long one, as Kansas winters often were. The prairie locked itself in cold, and the sky went gray, and the schoolhouse stove worked hard, and Elsie sent letters to a publisher in Kansas City about a book she was writing, a guide for frontier schoolteachers about teaching in mixed-level rural classrooms, and she went on being exactly and completely herself. And Clement went on doing his job with the additional quality of a man who has something worth coming home to, which was a different and better version of the job. He called on her formally, with Mrs. Farley's knowledge and blessing, twice a week in the evenings, and they would sit in Mrs. Farley's parlor or, when the weather permitted, on the front porch, and talk about everything with the inexhaustible interest of two people who have found someone whose company makes the world more interesting. He found that she challenged his thinking in ways that he liked being challenged. She did not argue for the sake of argument, but she did not concede for the sake of peace. And when she disagreed with him, she said so directly with her reasons. And when he gave her reasons that changed her thinking, she acknowledged it with the same directness. And the whole business of being with her was more honest and more satisfying than anything he had experienced in a life of relationships that had, he now understood, generally involved a great deal of careful management of the other person's comfort at the expense of genuine contact. He was honest with her in return. He told her about the things in his past that he had kept quiet, the brother he had lost in the war, the father who had not come back from the same war, the years between then and Caldwell that he had spent moving west with the particular momentum of a person who has nothing pulling them back and nothing yet pulling them forward. He told her about the specific quality of loneliness that his job created, the way authority could isolate you even in the middle of a community you cared about, the way being responsible for everyone meant belonging fully to no one. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention she gave everything full, real, not waiting for her turn to speak but actually inside the words he was saying, feeling their weight. She said, "I think loneliness is worst when you can't name it, when you just feel wrong somehow and don't know why." He said, "Yes, exactly that," she said. "I think I've been lonely since Ohio, since the letter and all of it. I had support, but I'd also made people afraid to get too close in case it was costly." He said, "You don't have to be afraid of that here." She looked at him with an expression that did things to his composure that he no longer made any serious effort to prevent. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still here." He proposed to her on a Wednesday evening in March of 1879 at Mrs. Farley's parlor table, somewhat to his own surprise. He had been planning to wait for a more scenic occasion, something more deliberate and staged, but they were in the middle of a conversation about something she was reading, and she said something that made him suddenly completely certain in a way that did not feel like impulsiveness but like recognition, and he said, "Elsie, will you marry me?" She went very still. Not with shock, she did not look shocked. She looked like a person receiving something they have been expecting in a form slightly different from the expected form. Then she said, "Yes, Clement, I will." Mrs. Farley, who had been in the kitchen, came into the doorway immediately, which meant she had been standing just outside it, and she said, "Oh, thank goodness," with such fervent relief that both Clement and Elsie laughed, which was probably the right note to begin an engagement on. They were married in June of 1879, in the church where they had first talked about walking together, on a bright warm morning with the town largely in attendance, because Caldwell had decided collectively to be happy about this union in the way that small communities decide about things all at once, and with enthusiasm that has some relationship to guilt about previous positions. Even Drummond was there, with a gift of silver candlesticks that Clement suspected had been his wife's idea, and even Harker made a brief and stiff appearance at the reception that was held in Mrs. Farley's large garden, which had been decorated with wildflowers that Clara Hawkins and 4 other children from the school had gathered the morning of the wedding. Elsie wore a dress of ivory cotton that she had made herself with help from Mrs. Farley and 2 other women, and she carried a small bunch of the wildflowers, and she walked down the church aisle with the same uprightness she brought to every entrance she ever made. And when she reached him at the front of the church and turned to face him, the expression on her face was the unguarded, warm, specific one he had first seen on the prairie in October, and he felt it in every part of himself. The minister asked if he took this woman, and he said yes with more certainty than he had felt about anything in many years, and the minister asked if she took this man, and she said, "I do," with the particular quality of decision that meant she had considered it fully and found it the right answer, and was not going to revisit the question. They had a small house on Chestnut Street. He had bought it the spring before, larger than the one he had been living in, with a proper kitchen and a garden behind it, and a room that Elsie immediately identified as the right size for a study where she could write in the evenings. The house smelled of fresh paint and possibility, and Elsie put her books on the shelves and her prairie flowers pressed under glass in frames she had made and her portable chalkboard in the study where she could see it and remember what it had meant. And it became a home with the speed that homes become homes when the people making them have been waiting for the right materials. She went on teaching. The school board, now operating with a majority that was squarely in favor of Elsie's methods, extended her contract indefinitely, and she continued to expand what she was doing. She started an evening class for adults who had never had the chance to learn to read, which met twice a week, and which by the winter of 1879 had 23 attendees, ranging in age from 18 to 57. She finished her book for Frontier Schoolteachers and sent it to the publisher in Kansas City, and received, in February of 1880, a letter accepting it for publication that she brought to Clement's office at mid-morning and read aloud to him in its entirety, her voice careful and controlled until the last paragraph, and then cracking slightly with something that she would not have called crying, and which was clearly its near neighbor. He came around his desk, and she let him hold her, which she did without losing any of her particular quality of standing straight, as if being held by him and standing in her own full presence were not contradictory, which he had come to understand they were not. Their first child was born in November of 1880, a boy they named Thomas, after Clement's brother. Thomas came into the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of frank assessment, which the midwife described as the most opinionated baby I've seen in 20 years, which both parents found appropriate. Clement held his son in the first hour of his life with an expression that Elsie later described to Mrs. Farley as the most thoroughly undone I've ever seen him, which was accurate. He stood at the window with the baby against his chest and looked out at the Caldwell night and felt the full weight of a life he had not known he was building until it was nearly complete. Clara Hawkins, who by this time was 14 and had been Elsie's most devoted student for 2 years, came to see the baby and held him with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. And Elsie watched this and thought about a book pressed into a 12-year-old's hands in a farmhouse and the long chain of small moments that had led from there to here. And she felt the specific satisfaction of a person who knows that the thing they decided to fight for was worth fighting for. Dale Hawkins had, in the end, come around. Not dramatically. He was not a man for dramatic reversals, but incrementally, in the way that people sometimes shift when the world demonstrates clearly and repeatedly that their position is costing them something they value. What changed him was not an argument but a conversation between his daughter and himself, one evening in the spring of 1879, when Clara told her father what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to be a schoolteacher. She wanted to go to the normal school that Elsie had attended, the one in Ohio, and she had been saving her small money for 2 years, and she had a letter of reference from Miss Merriweather, Mrs. Lockhart now, and she needed her father's permission, which he was going to give her, she said, not as a request but as an announcement, with the particular clarity of a girl who had been learning from the right person for 2 years. Dale Hawkins had given his permission. He had also, privately and without fanfare, told Clement at the hardware store one afternoon that his daughter was going to be something, and that some of that was Mrs. Lockhart's doing, and that he supposed that was a good thing, which was the closest Dale Hawkins had ever come to an apology, and which Clement received with a short nod and a "she is, yes," and the subject was then permanently closed. Clement's position in Caldwell had settled into something more secure after the events of 1878. He was reappointed at the next election by a wide margin. The council composition shifted over the following years. Harker retired from the council in 1880 and was replaced by a younger rancher who had no history of conflict with the Lockharts, and Drummond remained but had adopted a pragmatic civility with both Clement and Elsie that was less than warm and more than hostile, which was probably the best outcome available. The territory of Kansas continued its turbulent development. The cattle trade that had made Caldwell wealthy created the predictable tensions, drovers arriving at the end of the long trail from Texas, trail-weary and paid, and looking for ways to spend their pay, which required the balance of services and order that was Clement's daily work. He was good at it. He was firm without being brutal, and he had the particular quality of lawmen who know the difference between crimes of desperation and crimes of character, and he administered justice with a consistency that even the people on the receiving end generally acknowledged as fair. There were hard days. There was the winter of 1881, which was devastating to several of the area's homesteading families, and Clement helped organize relief efforts through the church and the county, and pushed hard enough against the territorial government's slow response that he received an irritated letter from the county commissioner, which he kept on his desk as a badge of honor. There was a violent incident in the spring of 1882 involving a dispute over grazing rights that turned bad before Clement could prevent it, and the aftermath of that was hard in a way that settled in him and stayed for a while, and Elsie held him through the heavy nights of that period with the same full presence she brought to all the good ones, and that was the thing about her that he valued most, if he had to name it. She did not flinch from the real texture of life, not the dark parts any more than the bright ones, and being with someone who would not flinch meant you did not have to manage the darkness alone, and that was worth more than he had words for. Their second child came in 1883, a girl they named Margaret, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's particular quality of stillness, which on a 3-year-old manifested as an unnerving ability to observe everything in a room simultaneously. Thomas, who was 3 when his sister arrived, received her with the generosity of a child who had been told what to expect and had decided to feel warmly about it. And the warmth held, and they grew up in the Chestnut Street house with their parents' books everywhere and their mother's voice in the evenings reading aloud, and their father's presence like something steady and reliable as the plains themselves. Elsie's book on frontier teaching had been published in the spring of 1880, with modest initial reception, and then a steadily growing readership as word spread through the networks of rural school teachers across the territory and beyond. By 1883, it had been reprinted twice and had been adopted by 2 normal schools as a supplementary text, which meant her ideas were being read by people who would go on to teach other children in schoolhouses across the West. She received letters from these people, from teachers in Wyoming and Colorado and Nebraska and Texas, and she answered every one of them with the same care she brought to her students, and these correspondences grew into something that was its own kind of teaching, extended far beyond the walls of the Caldwell schoolhouse. She still taught in that schoolhouse, every day that school was in session, for 14 years. The building was expanded in 1884 to accommodate the town's growing population, and expanded again in 1889, and Elsie was part of both planning processes, pressing successfully for a proper library room, which she stocked with books through a combination of the school board's budget, donations she solicited personally, and a contribution from the Kansas State Library that she had arranged through 3 months of correspondence with increasing firmness. Clement would sometimes arrive in the late afternoon to walk her home and wait outside the schoolhouse while she finished. There was usually something to finish, a conversation with a student or a letter to write or a book to find for someone who needed it, and he would hear her through the window, that clear and direct voice in the late light, and he would lean against the school's wall and let the sound of it settle around him. And he would think about Monday morning in 1878 and the road north and the county line marker, and the thing that had passed between them that had not quite been said. And he thought that the most significant moments in a life were often the ones where what was left out of the speech was more important than what went in, and that the best decisions were sometimes the ones you made in the space between the words. They stayed in Caldwell. This was not a foregone conclusion. There were years when the opportunities elsewhere were real, when the political turbulence of frontier life made other destinations briefly attractive. In 1885, Clement was offered the position of federal marshal for the district, which would have meant moving to Topeka and a significantly expanded authority and salary, and he and Elsie discussed it for 3 evenings at the kitchen table, with Thomas eating his supper and Margaret learning to walk by holding onto chair legs, and the stove throwing warmth across the room. He wanted what she thought. She wanted what he felt was right. They went around the thing several times and came back to the same place, which was that Caldwell was home, and they had built something here that they were not done with, and that the scale of the federal marshal's office did not match the scale of what Clement was good at, which was knowing a place, and the people in it deeply enough to serve them well. He wrote back to Topeka and declined, and he felt nothing but certainty about it, which was probably the best way to feel about a large decision. In the spring of 1886, Clara Hawkins came back from normal school in Ohio. She had done 2 years there, stretching a program that normally took 1 year, because she had added every optional course available to her. And she had come back with a teaching certificate and an expression of such comprehensive, determined capability that the school board, which had been without a second teacher for months, hired her before she had fully unpacked. She taught alongside Elsie for the next 3 years, and the 2 of them together transformed what the Caldwell School was able to offer, and the children who came through that schoolhouse in the late 1880s had an education that bore no resemblance to what frontier children were typically expected to receive. Dale Hawkins attended Clara's first day of teaching. He sat in the back of the room and watched his daughter stand in front of a room of children with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were and why. And afterward he walked to the Lockhart house on Chestnut Street and knocked on the door. And when Elsie answered, he said, without preamble, "You were right." He then turned and walked back down the street without waiting for a response, which Elsie found hilarious, and which she told Clement about with great delight that evening, doing an impression of Dale Hawkins's expression that was precise and affectionate, and caused Clement to laugh with the full, genuine laugh that only Elsie could reliably produce in him. Thomas Lockhart went to school to become a doctor, leaving Caldwell in the fall of 1899, when he was 18, for the Kansas City Medical College. Margaret Lockhart, who was 16 then, and whose stillness had resolved itself into a quality of patient observation that her mother recognized and her father respected, was 3 years from finishing her schooling, and she finished it at the Caldwell school where her mother had taught her, which she later described in a letter she wrote for a regional newspaper as the best education available anywhere, which was probably not objectively true, but which was entirely sincerely meant. Clement turned 40 in 1887, and Elsie organized a gathering at the house that she described as small, and which was attended by 43 people, which was either small by Caldwell standards or a reflection of how many people had come to value the Lockhart household as a place where good things happened. Mrs. Farley came, older now and moving more slowly, but with the same keen warmth of attention that had been present when she first opened her boarding-house door to a woman with a satchel full of books and a determination the size of the Kansas sky. She sat in the garden with a glass of lemonade and watched the gathering with an expression of proprietary satisfaction, as if she had known from the first day that it would come to this. The last years of the century brought changes to Caldwell that were both gains and losses. The cattle trade began its decline as the great drives from Texas gave way to local ranching and the railroad's reach extended. The population shifted. Some families left for more prosperous places and new ones came. The town became something slightly different from what it had been in 1878, which was perhaps inevitable, but the core of it, the people who had been there through the hard years and the good ones, remained, and they were the people who made Caldwell feel like itself. Clement served as sheriff until 1895, when he was 48 years old and had held the position for 17 years, which made him the longest-serving sheriff in the county's history. When he finally handed his star to the man he had trained as his successor, a steady, careful young man named Davis Alcott, who had come up through the deputy ranks with Walt Akers's same gift for useful information and a quality of fairness that Clement had spent 3 years carefully cultivating. He felt no particular grief about it. He had given the job everything it required of him, and it had given him back the life he had built around it, and the exchange seemed fair. He went into the law instead, which surprised several people and surprised him not at all. He had spent 17 years learning the territorial statutes and their applications more thoroughly than most men trained specifically for the purpose, and he had opinions about how the law should be practiced that he had been keeping in reserve, and he apprenticed himself to the county's senior attorney, a careful old man who respected Clement's knowledge and complemented it with the formal education that the years in law school would have given him. He passed the Kansas bar examination in 1896 and began practicing in a modest office 2 streets from the sheriff's office and 3 streets from the schoolhouse, which gave him a view from his window of the route between the two that he had walked so many times in so many moods that it was practically a map of his adult life. Elsie was 53 years old in 1905, and she was still teaching, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew her. The normal school question had come up repeatedly. She had been offered positions at 2 Kansas normal schools, both of which would have elevated her professionally and multiplied her influence, and both of which she had declined because the children in the Caldwell schoolhouse were the children she was responsible for. And she had never been able to convince herself that abstraction was a fair trade for the particular and living reality of a child learning to read or understanding for the first time that the world was larger than the Kansas prairie. She did right, though. The Frontier Schoolteacher book had been followed by two others, one on teaching children who came from non-English-speaking backgrounds, which was a pressing need in the growing communities of the Western Territories, and which she had researched by correspondence with teachers in communities she couldn't visit, and one, her favorite, a collection of essays about learning and what it was for, which was the most personal thing she had published, and which had a quiet but lasting influence in the conversations happening in educational institutions about the purpose of schooling in a democratic society. Clement read everything she wrote, every draft of everything, which was the kind of reading that meant actual engagement notes in margins, questions at dinner, specific comments that told her he had understood not just the surface of the argument but its structure and its stakes. She valued this completely. She had never expected to find someone who read her work that way, and she had it. On an evening in the spring of 1906, 28 years after Elsie Merriweather had arrived in Caldwell on the westbound stage, and looked around the town with that frank assessment of a woman who knows what she's come to do, they sat on the porch of the Chestnut Street house and watched the evening come in over the prairie. Thomas was a doctor in Wichita by then, married to a woman named Helen who was as steady and good as Thomas himself, with two small children of their own, Clement and Elsie's grandchildren, who visited in the summers, and to whom Elsie had already begun explaining things about stars and rivers and the way seeds grew, because she was constitutionally unable to be in the presence of a curious child without beginning to teach. Margaret was in Lawrence, doing graduate studies in history at the University of Kansas, which she had entered with the patient purposefulness that had always been her particular quality. Clement had his coffee and Elsie had her tea, and the evening was warm, and the prairie sky was doing its extravagant thing with the colors as the sun went down, the same thing it had been doing above them on the rise outside of town in October of 1878 when he had kissed her for the first time, and she had smiled with her full, open, unguarded expression. She said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you just let the stage take me instead of coming to get me?" He thought about this. "I think you would have come back anyway," he said. "By some route," she smiled. "Probably, though I hadn't quite worked out the plan when you arrived." "I know," he said. The plan involved being camped by a creek for an indeterminate period teaching children under a cottonwood tree. "It was a very good cottonwood tree," she said. He laughed, full and real in the way that she could always produce in him. "It was," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the day was over and the world was quiet. He put his arm around her. The prairie sky went on with its colors, orange deepening to red, then purple, the first stars appearing over the east where the sky was already dark. An owl called somewhere in the elm trees along the fence. From somewhere in the house behind them, the clock on the mantel ticked with its steady domestic certainty. He thought about the county line marker, and the morning they had ridden back into Caldwell side by side, and the town council meeting where he had stood at the head of the room and said what he had to say, and every morning since then that he had come home to her, to the house that smelled of her books and her pressed flowers, and whatever she was cooking, and the particular atmosphere that her presence created, which was one of complete honesty and complete warmth, and the sense that the world's full complexity was welcome here and would be faced with clear eyes and an open heart. He thought that the specific wisdom of Friday morning riding south to get her, bringing her back, was not that it had been the heroic or the grand thing, but that it had been the true thing, the one his judgment pointed to when he cleared away the noise of institutional pressure and social calculation, and sat with what he actually knew, which was that the woman by the creek with her portable chalkboard and her refusal to be diminished was the one real and irreplaceable thing in his life. and that the measure of a man was whether he could recognize that and act on it while it still mattered. He thought that Elsie had seen this about him before he had seen it himself, which was probably consistent with everything else about her. She was reading something in the last of the light. She was always reading something in the last of the light, until it was too dark and she had to give up the book. He watched her turn the page and trace a line with her finger, and her lips move slightly with a particularly interesting sentence, and he felt the particular fullness of a man who has everything he ever actually wanted and knows it. "What are you reading?" he said. She showed him the cover. It was a new book from an Eastern publisher, something philosophical about the nature of justice, which was the kind of thing she read for pleasure, which was one of the many reasons he loved her. "Is it good?" he said. "It has some wrong ideas in it," she said, "and some interesting ones." She settled back against him. "I'll tell you about both." "Please," he said. The evening continued around them, and the stars came out, and the prairie was quiet and dark and enormous, and they sat on their porch on Chestnut Street in Caldwell, Kansas, and Elsie Merriweather, who had arrived 28 years ago on a Tuesday and been escorted out on a Monday and come back on a Friday and stayed for the rest of her life, told her husband about the wrong ideas and the interesting ones. And he listened, and they were very much at home. The years went on in the way that good years do, full of ordinary days that are not ordinary at all when you attend to them closely, which was what the Lockharts did, because that was who they were. Thomas and Helen brought the children to Caldwell in the summer of 1907, and the house on Chestnut Street was full of the noise of young ones again, which Clement bore with patient amusement, and Elsie threw herself into with her characteristic complete engagement, sitting on the kitchen floor at 6 in the morning teaching her 4-year-old granddaughter the names of the planets, which the 4-year-old received with the focused gravity of someone taking on an important responsibility. Margaret came back from Lawrence in the fall of 1907 with her degree and a position she had been offered at a school in Topeka, which she took with the same purposefulness with which she did all things. She came to Caldwell for Christmas that year and sat at the family table with her parents and her brother and his family and Mrs. Farley, who was elderly now and moved slowly, but was still herself completely, sharp-tongued and warm-hearted and present for every important occasion as she had been present for the first ones. And the table was full of voices and food, and the quality of accumulated history between people who have known each other through enough seasons to have real depth. Clement stood for a moment in the doorway of the dining room before he sat down, looking at all of them, his wife at the head of the table, talking to Margaret with the expression of a woman whose proudest achievements are sitting across from her, his son with his wife and the children, Mrs. Farley with her cider glass, Walt Akers, who had come by after his shift as Caldwell's senior deputy, still young enough in spirit to eat twice what everyone else did, Clara Hawkins's family at the far end, Clara herself now the head of the Caldwell School's teaching staff, and he felt what he always felt in these moments, which was that he had been given something he had not known to ask for, something beyond his calculation. He sat down. Elsie looked across the table at him with her amber eyes and the expression that was both specific and complete, the one that said she was seeing him clearly and was glad of what she saw. And he met it with the same fullness, because he was her husband and her ally and her reader and her walker through all weathers, and she was his, and they had built this life together out of a Monday morning and a county line and a cottonwood tree and a decision to come back, and it was entirely and perfectly theirs. In the quiet of the winter of 1908, Caldwell's town council voted unanimously to name the expanded schoolhouse the Merriweather School in honor of its longest-serving teacher, who had taught there for 30 years and transformed what it meant to be educated in the southern Kansas plains. The vote was Morrison's idea, although Morrison was himself long retired from the council. He had spoken to the current members, and the motion carried before anyone had time to find an objection. They told Elsie at a gathering in the school itself, with the current students assembled and several of her former students present, including Clara Hawkins, who had known about the naming for a week and had maintained a silence that must have cost her considerable effort. When Drummond's son, who was now on the council, stood up and made the announcement, carrying the thing his father should have done 30 years ago, redeeming something across the gap of a generation, Elsie sat in the front row with Clement's hand in hers, and she received it with the composure that was always hers, and that did not ever mean she was not moved, but meant that her movement was interior and real, and not performed. Afterward she walked through the schoolhouse with Clement, looking at everything: the map on the east wall, the shelf of books, the table where Clara sat to do her planning, the jar of pressed flowers still in the window, replaced and renewed each year, a small continuing tradition that some student always maintained without being asked to, which meant something about the kind of place it was. She stopped at her own desk, still hers, still where she sat when she was teaching, though with less frequency now that Clara ran the daily work, and she ran her hand along the surface, worn smooth by 25 years of elbows and books and chalk dust, and she said, "I cleaned this floor on my hands and knees the first week I was here when they hadn't even given me the job yet." "I know," Clement said. "I looked through the window." She turned to him. "I knew you were there," she said. "I heard your horse." He thought about this. "You didn't look up." "I didn't want you to think I'd noticed," she said, and her smile was warm and specific and his, the way it had always been his specifically, and he shook his head slightly because even after 30 years she had the capacity to surprise him, and he found this extraordinary. "I should have come inside," he said. "You would have," she said. "You just needed a few more weeks." She took his arm. "You've always been thorough." They walked home along the familiar streets of Caldwell in the winter afternoon, arm in arm. Through the town they had both committed their lives to: the hardware store where Morrison had once stopped to shake Clement's hand, the boarding house where Mrs. Farley had watched them from the window with her cup of tea, the church where they had married in June of 1879, the sheriff's office where it had all found its shape, the road that led south toward the Bender Creek crossing, and beyond that the cottonwood trees by the creek where a woman had once made her camp and held her ground. The school bore her name now, which was right, and which she wore with the characteristic lightness of someone who measures their life not in honors but in outcomes, not in what she was called but in what Clara Hawkins became, and what the children of Caldwell carried with them, and what was written in the books she had made, and the letters she had received, and the people who had sat at her table and learned something true. That was the measure, and by that measure, and by every other measure that the long sweep of a life well lived can provide, Elsie Merriweather Lockhart had won her argument, the one she had been making since before she arrived in this town on a dusty Wednesday in July, the argument that a person's full self was worth defending, and a community's character was determined by how it treated the ones who refused to be diminished. And Clement Lockhart, sheriff and husband and reader and man who had been thorough and then decisive when it mattered, had been her partner in that argument from the Friday morning he rode south to get her, which was the day he had finally and completely become who he was supposed to be. The Chestnut Street house was warm when they got home, and there was soup on the stove that Elsie had started that morning, and the lamps made yellow circles on the walls, and the clock ticked on the mantel, and outside the plains lay dark and wide and enduring under the winter sky, and inside there was light. They were home, and they were together, and everything was exactly as it should be.